A retired teacher receives a letter. After 50 years, the rain had started some time before dawn. Not a storm. Not the kind that rattled windows or frightened children. Just a slow Vermont rain. Quiet, patient. The kind that seemed to belong to old towns and older memories. Thomas Whitaker stood by the kitchen window with both hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic coffee mug. Steam curled softly past his glasses as he stared out at Willow Street. The road was empty. Wet orange leaves clung to the sidewalk like forgotten photographs. Across the street, Mrs. Delaney's porch swing moved gently in the wind, creaking every few seconds. Somewhere in the distance, church bells echoed faintly through the cold October morning. Thomas listened to them longer than most people would. At 78, silence had become something he noticed too easily. The old house around him settled with tiny groans, pipes clicking, floorboards whispering, the refrigerator humming like a tired old man. 12 years ago, mornings used to sound different. Back then, Margaret would already be awake. The smell of cinnamon oatmeal would drift from the stove. Nat King Cole would play softly from the radio. She would stand near the sink in her blue robe, humming quietly while rain tapped against the windows. Now there was only silence. Thomas took another sip of coffee. Cold already. He glanced toward the empty chair across from him. Her chair. For a moment, he almost spoke aloud. "Looks like rain all day, Maggie." But the words stayed in his throat. Outside, the mail truck rolled slowly down the street. Thomas watched it stop at each house like a ritual the town had repeated for generations. Bills, advertisements, medical notices, coupons no one used. Life reduced to envelopes. A few moments later, the mailbox lid clanged shut. Thomas sighed softly and reached for his cardigan hanging by the door. His knees hurt this morning. Rain always did that. He stepped onto the porch carefully, breathing in the smell of wet wood and fallen leaves. The cold air touched his face gently. For a second, he closed his eyes. October in Ashford Falls always smelled the same. Rain, pine trees, old brick, smoke from distant chimneys. It reminded him of football games, school buses, young voices echoing through hallways. Another life. Thomas opened the mailbox. Mostly junk mail. A pharmacy flyer, electric bill. Then he saw it. A cream-colored envelope. No return address. His name was written in dark blue ink. Mr. Thomas Whitaker. The handwriting stopped him cold. Not because he recognized it immediately. Because it felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain. Like hearing an old song through a wall. Thomas frowned slightly. His fingers trembled as he carried the envelope back inside. The rain followed him onto the porch in tiny silver droplets. Back in the kitchen, he sat slowly at the table. The envelope rested in front of him beside the untouched newspaper. For some reason, he hesitated. At his age, strange letters rarely brought good news. Hospital notices, insurance changes, funeral announcements. The older you became, the smaller the world got. Thomas adjusted his glasses and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. Nothing else. No signature, no address, no explanation. He unfolded it slowly. One sentence, just one. You saved my life, Mr. Whitaker. Thomas stared at the words. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Even the rain seemed distant now. He read the sentence again, then again. You saved my life, Mr. Whitaker. His chest tightened unexpectedly. Somewhere deep inside him, something old stirred awake. A memory, a face, a classroom, but it vanished before he could hold on to it. Thomas leaned back slowly in his chair. Saved my life? He tried to think. Thousands of students had passed through his classroom over 42 years of teaching literature at Ashford Falls High School. Thousands of names, thousands of papers graded late at night. Teenagers who became adults, adults who disappeared into the world. Some successful, some broken, most forgotten by time. Or perhaps he had been forgotten by them. That thought had lived quietly inside him for years. After retirement, the phone stopped ringing. Former colleagues moved away or died. Students stopped visiting. Even the town itself seemed to move around him now, faster every year. Sometimes he wondered if his life had mattered at all. Thomas lowered the paper slowly. His eyes drifted toward the bookshelf near the fireplace. An old yearbook sat there among dusty photo albums. Something about the handwriting bothered him. Not unpleasantly. Familiar. Painfully familiar. A sudden image flashed through his mind. A teenage boy sitting near the back window of his classroom, head lowered, always sketching something in the margins of his notebook, dark hair falling over tired eyes. Quiet. Too quiet. Thomas blinked. The image disappeared. He stood carefully and walked toward the bookshelf. Rain tapped softly against the windows behind him. His fingers slid across old spines and dusty frames until he found the yearbook. The cover was faded blue. Ashford Falls High School, 1971. Thomas carried it back to the kitchen table. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, then slowly opened the cover. Young faces smiled back at him from another lifetime. Football players, cheerleaders, future nurses, future mechanics, future ghosts. Thomas turned pages carefully. Classrooms, drama club, science fair. Then suddenly, his breath caught. There, second row from the back, a boy with tired eyes, Daniel Harper. Thomas froze. Outside, thunder rumbled softly across the distant hills, and for the first time in many years, Thomas Whitaker felt his heart begin to race. Autumn of 1971 arrived early in Ashford Falls. By the second week of September, red leaves already covered the sidewalks outside the high school, and cold winds swept through the parking lot every morning as students hurried inside carrying textbooks and paper lunch bags. Back then, Thomas Whitaker was 33 years old, young enough to still believe he could change lives, old enough to know some children arrived at school already carrying burdens too heavy for their age. Room 214 smelled faintly of chalk dust, coffee, and old books. Thomas liked arriving before everyone else. The silence before students entered always felt sacred somehow. He straightened stacks of essays on his desk and wrote the morning assignment across the blackboard in careful white letters. Literature teaches us how to survive ourselves. He paused after writing it, then smiled faintly. Too dramatic, Margaret would have said. Outside the classroom window, yellow school buses pulled into the lot one by one. Soon the hallways exploded with noise. Lockers slammed. Teenagers laughed. Someone shouted across the corridor. A radio played somewhere in the distance. Life. Messy, loud, restless life. Students slowly filled the classroom. Thomas greeted them the same way every morning. "Good morning, Emily." "Morning, Jack." "Nice to see you, Susan." Some answered politely. Some barely looked up. Teenagers had always mastered the art of pretending not to care. Then Thomas noticed him again. The boy in the last row near the window. Daniel Harper. 17 years old. Thin, quiet, always wearing the same faded green jacket regardless of weather. His dark hair hung slightly over his eyes, and his notebooks were covered in tiny pencil sketches instead of notes. He never caused trouble, never spoke unless called on, never looked comfortable. Thomas had noticed that during the first week of school. Some children demanded attention. Others tried desperately to disappear. Daniel belonged to the second kind. As students settled into their seats, two boys near the middle row snickered quietly. "Hey, Harper," one muttered. "You sleep in that jacket too?" A few students laughed softly. Daniel didn't react, didn't even look up. He simply opened his notebook and stared at the page. Thomas felt something twist inside him. Not anger exactly. Recognition. Teachers learned to recognize loneliness the same way doctors recognized illness. Sometimes it showed in bruises, sometimes in silence. Thomas walked slowly between desks as class began. "Today," he said gently, "we're talking about why people read stories in difficult times." Most students looked half awake. A girl near the front yawned dramatically. A football player tapped his pencil against the desk. But Daniel listened. Thomas noticed it immediately. Not openly, not eagerly, but carefully, like someone listening from far away. As the lesson continued, Thomas asked students to discuss a passage from To Kill a Mockingbird. Hands rose lazily around the room. Then, unexpectedly, Daniel spoke, quietly, almost too softly to hear. People read stories because it helps them believe life can change. The room became still for a moment. Even Daniel seemed surprised he had spoken aloud. Thomas looked at him carefully. "And do you believe that, Daniel?" The boy hesitated. His fingers tightened around the pencil. Finally, he shrugged. "I think people want to." Then he lowered his eyes again. Something about that answer stayed with Thomas all day. After class ended, students flooded noisily into the hallway, but Daniel remained seated, sketching again. Thomas pretended to organize papers while watching discreetly. Finally, he walked closer. "What are you drawing?" Daniel immediately closed the notebook. "Nothing." Thomas smiled gently. Usually when teenagers say nothing, it means something important. For a moment, Daniel almost smiled. Almost. Reluctantly, he slid the notebook forward. Thomas looked down. The sketch was extraordinary. A detailed drawing of a small lakeside house beneath autumn trees. The reflection in the water. The shadows. The tiny details in the windows. It looked peaceful, safe. Thomas blinked in surprise. "You drew this?" Daniel nodded once. That's remarkable. The boy looked uncomfortable immediately, as if compliments were dangerous. It's stupid, he muttered. No, Thomas said softly. It isn't. For a few seconds, silence filled the classroom. Outside the hallway buzzed with distant teenage voices. Finally, Thomas asked carefully, "Have you ever thought about architecture?" Daniel let out a short laugh. Not amused. People like me don't become architects. The words hit Thomas harder than they should have. People like me. A sentence no 17-year-old should ever believe. Thomas leaned lightly against the desk. You know, he said quietly, sometimes the world is wrong about people. Daniel looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time, Thomas saw it clearly. Exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion. The kind that lived deeper. The kind teenagers should never carry. Before Thomas could say anything else, the final bell rang downstairs. Daniel quickly grabbed his notebook. Sorry, he murmured, then disappeared into the hallway. Thomas stood alone in the empty classroom. The afternoon sun faded behind gathering gray clouds outside the window. Something about that boy troubled him deeply now. Not because he was loud, not because he acted out, because he looked like someone slowly disappearing while surrounded by people. Thomas glanced toward the back row. Daniel had forgotten a sheet of paper beneath the desk. Thomas picked it up carefully. It was another drawing, this one unfinished. A train station in the rain, and standing alone beneath the platform lights, a man holding a suitcase. Underneath the sketch, written faintly in pencil, were 4 words. Some people never stay. Thomas stared at the page for a long time, then slowly folded it and placed it inside his briefcase. Outside, autumn rain began falling over Ashford Falls once again. By late November, the cold had settled deeply into Ashford Falls, creeping through cracked window frames and beneath old front doors with the quiet persistence of something that knew it would not be leaving any time soon. And every morning the town seemed to wake beneath a sky the color of faded newspaper ink, while exhausted parents hurried toward factories, diners, and hardware stores before sunrise. Daniel Harper hated mornings most of all. Not because he disliked school, and not because he feared the long walk through streets littered with wet leaves and slush, but because mornings inside the Harper house always carried the heavy uncertainty of what kind of mood his father had brought home the night before. Some mornings the silence was almost peaceful. Other mornings it felt dangerous. That Thursday began with silence. The old house sat near the edge of town beside the railroad tracks, where passing freight trains rattled dishes inside kitchen cabinets and loose nails trembled faintly within the walls. And although the house had probably once belonged to a family filled with ordinary dreams and ordinary laughter, time had stripped nearly all warmth from it long ago. Daniel woke before dawn beneath 2 heavy blankets that still failed to keep the cold away, and for several seconds he simply stared at the cracked ceiling above him while listening carefully for movement elsewhere in the house. Because over the years he had developed the instinctive caution of someone who understood that peace could disappear without warning. No yelling, no broken glass, no footsteps, only the distant whistle of a train somewhere beyond town. Slowly, Daniel sat up and rubbed his tired eyes before reaching for the sweater hanging beside his bed. And as he dressed quietly in the dim gray light filtering through the curtains, his attention drifted toward the sketchbook lying beneath his pillow, hidden there the way other teenagers might hide cigarettes or money. Drawing was the only thing in his life that still felt untouched, the only place where the world became quieter. He slipped the sketchbook into his backpack before opening the bedroom door carefully. The hallway smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and stale beer. Downstairs, the television was still on from the night before, casting flickering blue light across the living room where his father slept half sideways on the couch, one arm hanging toward the floor beside an overturned bottle. Daniel looked away immediately. His mother was already awake in the kitchen. She stood at the stove wearing a pale yellow robe that hung loosely from her thinning shoulders, stirring oatmeal slowly while fighting another coughing spell into a folded handkerchief. And even from across the room, Daniel could see how exhausted she looked now, as though illness had slowly been draining color from her one season at a time. "There's coffee," she said softly without turning around. Daniel nodded. "Thanks, Mom." The kitchen remained quiet except for the ticking wall clock and the faint hiss of the radiator struggling against the cold. Once, years earlier, this room had probably felt different. Daniel sometimes tried to imagine it. Christmas mornings, birthday cakes, music on the radio, his mother laughing. But he could barely remember those days now. Most memories had become blurry around the edges, like old photographs left too long in sunlight. His mother finally sat across from him at the table, pressing the handkerchief gently against her lips before offering him a tired smile that carried more apology than happiness. "You slept okay?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Yeah." It was easier than telling the truth. She looked toward the living room briefly. He had a hard night. Daniel stared down at his oatmeal. The strange thing was that he no longer hated his father the way people might expect him to. Hatred required energy. And after years of disappointment, shouting, unpaid bills, and empty promises, all Daniel mostly felt now was exhaustion. Outside the kitchen window, snow had begun falling lightly over the railroad tracks behind the house, covering rusted fences and dead grass in a thin layer of white that somehow made even broken things appear softer from a distance. His mother noticed him staring outside. "You still drawing those houses?" Daniel shrugged carefully. "Sometimes. You're good at it." He gave a faint smile. "You haven't even seen them. A mother knows." For the first time that morning, something warm flickered briefly inside him. Then suddenly, glass shattered in the living room. Both of them flinched instinctively. His father's voice exploded through the house. "Why the hell is it so cold in here?" Daniel closed his eyes. There it was, the storm arriving. His mother stood quickly despite the pain in her joints. "I'll make breakfast." But Daniel gently touched her arm. "I'll go." She looked at him with heartbreaking guilt. The kind mothers carry when life becomes heavier than love alone can fix. As Daniel stepped into the living room, the smell hit him immediately. Beer, cigarettes, sweat, and old anger soaked into furniture that had absorbed too many bad years. His father glared toward him with bloodshot eyes. "You just gonna stand there?" Daniel quietly bent to pick up broken glass from the floor. "You think school makes you better than everybody else?" his father muttered. Daniel said nothing. Experience had taught him silence was safer. But inside his backpack, hidden between textbooks and unfinished homework assignments, rested page after page of beautiful hand-drawn homes with large windows, warm fireplaces, quiet lakes, and peaceful front porches beneath autumn trees. Homes where nobody shouted. Homes where nobody drank. Homes where people stayed. And sometimes, late at night beneath the weak glow of his bedside lamp, Daniel would sketch those imaginary houses for hours, while freight trains groaned through darkness outside his window, because somewhere deep inside himself, he still desperately wanted to believe that another kind of life existed beyond Ashford Falls. A life where rooms felt warm. A life where fathers smiled. A life where somebody waited for you to come home. The first heavy snowfall of December arrived overnight, transforming Ashford Falls into the kind of quiet winter town that looked beautiful from a distance, with white rooftops, glowing storefront windows, and smoke curling lazily from chimneys beneath a pale silver sky. Although beneath that peaceful surface most people carried private worries they rarely spoke aloud. And perhaps that was why Thomas Whitaker had always believed small towns were filled less with simplicity than with carefully hidden loneliness. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the hallways of Ashford Falls High School had erupted into their usual chaos as students hurried toward buses, while snow-covered boots squeaked against polished floors, and distant laughter echoed between rows of dented lockers. But inside room 214, the atmosphere remained unusually calm, softened by the fading winter light drifting through tall classroom windows. Thomas sat behind his desk, grading essays, while Nat King Cole played quietly from a small radio near the bookshelf. And although he appeared focused on correcting grammar mistakes in blue ink, part of his attention remained fixed on the boy seated silently near the back of the room. Daniel Harper had stayed after class again, not intentionally, perhaps, but not accidentally either. For nearly 20 minutes he had remained there sketching in his notebook while pretending to reorganize school papers. And Thomas recognized the behavior immediately because lonely people often lingered in places where they felt safe long after everyone else had left. Outside, snowflakes drifted slowly past the windows. The room smelled faintly of coffee, chalk dust, wet wool coats, and old books whose pages had yellowed with time. Finally, Thomas placed his pen down carefully and looked toward Daniel. "You know," he said gently, "most students leave this room like it's on fire the second the bell rings." Daniel didn't look up immediately. "Guess I'm not most students." "No," Thomas replied softly. "I don't think you are." For a moment, only the radio filled the silence between them. Then Thomas stood and walked slowly toward the classroom windows, watching snow gather along the football field outside where wind swept thin white trails across empty bleachers. "When I was your age," he said thoughtfully, "I used to stay after school because I hated going home too." That caught Daniel's attention. He looked up slightly. Thomas smiled faintly. "My father worked constantly. My mother worried constantly. The house always felt tense somehow, like everyone was carrying invisible weight, but pretending they weren't." Daniel stared quietly at his notebook. "You ever feel that way?" Thomas asked carefully. The question hung in the room longer than either of them expected. Most adults, Daniel had learned, never asked questions unless they already wanted a specific answer. Teachers asked about homework. Guidance counselors asked about grades. Neighbors asked polite things they didn't really care about. But this felt different. Thomas Whitaker wasn't interrogating him. He was listening. Daniel swallowed slowly. Sometimes, he admitted. Thomas nodded as though he understood far more than Daniel had actually said. Outside the windows, the snow continued falling thicker now, coating parked cars in soft white layers, while darkness slowly crept across the town beyond the school grounds. "You're very talented," Thomas said after a while. Daniel immediately shook his head. "No, I'm not." "Yes," Thomas replied calmly. "You are. It's just drawings." Thomas walked toward the desk near the back row where Daniel's sketchbook rested partially open, and after a brief pause, he gestured toward it gently. "May I?" Daniel hesitated before finally sliding the notebook forward. Thomas opened it carefully. Page after page revealed detailed sketches of homes, train stations, libraries, porches, staircases, and lakeside cabins drawn with astonishing precision and emotion. And what struck Thomas most was not simply the talent itself, but the atmosphere inside the drawings, because every building Daniel created seemed to contain the same quiet longing for warmth, safety, and belonging. "These are extraordinary," Thomas murmured honestly. Daniel looked embarrassed. "My dad says artists don't survive in the real world." Thomas turned another page slowly. "Your father wrong about anything else?" Daniel almost laughed. Almost. Then silence returned again. Thomas closed the sketchbook gently before sitting down in the desk beside Daniel rather than standing over him like a teacher delivering advice. And that small gesture alone made the conversation feel less like authority and more like trust. "Daniel," he said carefully, "do you know what I've learned after teaching for nearly 12 years? Daniel shrugged faintly. "The students who struggle the most to believe in themselves are usually the ones carrying the heaviest burdens." Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around his pencil. Thomas continued quietly. "And sometimes those same students grow into the strongest adults because they learn how to survive things other people never even see." The room became completely still. Outside, evening darkness settled across the snowy town while the old radio played softly in the corner, filling the silence with distant jazz melodies that somehow made the moment feel even more personal. Daniel stared downward for so long, Thomas wondered whether he had said too much. Then finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Daniel asked, "You really think people can change their lives?" Thomas looked at him carefully. Not at the tired jacket. Not at the guarded expression. Not at the poor grades in math or the exhaustion beneath his eyes. He looked at the frightened 17-year-old boy hidden beneath all of it. And with complete sincerity, Thomas answered, "Yes, Daniel, I do." Something fragile shifted across the boy's face then, so quickly and subtly that another person might not have noticed it at all. But Thomas did. Because for one brief moment, Daniel Harper looked less like someone disappearing, and more like someone trying, very carefully, to hold on. By January, winter had tightened its grip around Ashford Falls so completely that even the town itself seemed quieter beneath the endless snow. as though the streets, houses, and frozen trees had collectively surrendered to the long, cold season settling over Vermont, like a heavy white blanket that muted every sound except the occasional scraping of shovels and the distant groan of passing trains beyond the hills. The Christmas decorations still hung in several storefront windows downtown, although their cheerful lights now looked strangely tired after weeks of gray skies and bitter winds. And every afternoon, darkness arrived a little earlier, creeping slowly across sidewalks and parking lots until the town glowed beneath pale street lamps reflected in dirty snowbanks. Thomas Whitaker had always believed January revealed who people truly were. December allowed distractions, holiday dinners, music, presents, temporary warmth. But January stripped everything back down to silence. And silence, Thomas knew, had a way of exposing pain people spent the rest of the year trying to hide. That Thursday afternoon, Room 214 felt unusually cold despite the rattling radiator beneath the windows, and while students worked half-heartedly on essays about American poetry, Thomas found his attention drifting repeatedly toward the empty desk near the back row beside the window. Daniel Harper was absent. At first, Thomas told himself not to overthink it. Teenagers missed school all the time during winter. Flu season, bad roads, family problems. But by lunchtime, an uneasy feeling had settled into his chest with the quiet persistence of instinct. By the second day, the feeling worsened. Daniel still hadn't returned. Thomas mentioned it casually in the teacher's lounge while pouring stale coffee into a paper cup. "Harper's been out a couple days," he said. "Anybody heard anything?" Coach Brennan shrugged while reading the newspaper. "Probably snowed in near the tracks." Another teacher laughed lightly. "Or skipping class like every other teenage boy in America." Thomas forced a polite smile, but the answer didn't sit right with him. Daniel wasn't the type to disappear casually. Lonely students rarely abandoned the few safe places they had. That afternoon, snow fell heavily outside the classroom windows while the sky darkened hours before sunset, and as students packed their bags at the final bell, Thomas noticed Melissa Avery lingering near his desk with unusual hesitation. Melissa was one of those observant students teachers relied on without ever admitting it aloud. A quiet girl with sharp eyes who noticed more than adults realized. "Mr. Whitaker?" she asked softly. "Yes?" She hesitated before lowering her voice. "I think something happened to Daniel." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" Melissa glanced toward the empty hallway before speaking. "A few days before Christmas, I saw him after school near the parking lot," she said carefully. "His dad picked him up." Thomas waited silently. "He was yelling at him," she continued. "Really bad." Snow tapped softly against the windows. "What kind of yelling?" Melissa looked uncomfortable now. The kind where everybody pretends not to hear. For several seconds, Thomas said nothing, because unfortunately, he understood exactly what she meant. In small towns, people often became experts at looking away from things that felt painful or complicated, especially when children were involved, especially when alcohol was involved. "Thank you for telling me," Thomas said gently. Melissa nodded before leaving quietly. The classroom fell silent again. Thomas stared toward Daniel's empty desk while anxiety slowly twisted deeper inside him. Because over the years he had learned to recognize certain warning signs in students the same way sailors recognized storms gathering far out at sea. And Daniel carried too many of those signs already. Exhaustion, isolation, hopelessness, fear hidden beneath politeness. The kind of sadness that settled too deeply inside someone too young. That evening, after grading papers long past sunset, Thomas finally drove toward the Harper house through narrow, snow-covered roads lined with frozen trees and dim porch lights glowing weakly against the storm, although part of him questioned whether he was crossing a line by showing up uninvited at a student's home. But another part, the older, instinctive part teachers developed after years spent watching children quietly fall apart, refused to ignore the feeling gnawing at him. The Harper house looked even more worn beneath winter darkness. One porch light flickered weakly above the front steps while snow piled against the rusted mailbox near the road. Thomas sat in the car for a moment, watching the house silently. No movement inside. No television glow. No signs of life except smoke curling faintly from the chimney. Finally, he stepped out into the freezing wind. Snow crunched beneath his shoes as he approached the porch. He knocked once. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. Then finally, the door opened halfway. Daniel stood there. For a second, neither of them spoke. The boy looked exhausted. Worse than exhausted. His face was pale, shadows dark beneath his eyes, and along the left side of his jaw, faint purple bruising disappeared beneath the collar of his sweater. Thomas felt a quiet wave of anger rise inside him so suddenly he had to steady himself before speaking. "Daniel," he said softly, "we missed you at school." Daniel looked away immediately. "I'm fine." The oldest lie in the world. Behind him, the house remained dark and silent. Thomas noticed the smell of cigarette smoke drifting through the doorway. "You sick?" Daniel hesitated. "Something like that." For a moment, Thomas considered asking directly about the bruise, about the shouting Melissa had heard, about whatever invisible war this boy seemed to be surviving every day inside these walls. But he also knew frightened teenagers rarely opened up when cornered. So instead, he simply reached into his coat pocket and held out a small paper bag. Daniel looked confused. "What's that?" "Margaret made too much chicken soup," Thomas replied lightly. "If I bring another container home, she's going to accuse me of trying to turn the refrigerator into a science experiment." For the first time in days, something close to warmth flickered briefly across Daniel's face. A tiny, almost smile. He accepted the bag carefully. "Thanks." Thomas nodded. Then, very gently, he said, "You know, Daniel, sometimes people carry things they think they have to survive alone." Daniel stared at the snow-covered porch boards. "But they don't." The wind moved softly through the trees around the house. For several long seconds, Daniel looked as though he might say something important, something honest, something painful. But then a loud crash echoed somewhere deeper inside the house. Both of them froze instantly. Daniel's expression changed at once. Fear, quick, automatic, familiar. "I should go," he murmured quickly. Thomas looked toward the darkness inside the house, then back at Daniel, and suddenly, with terrible clarity, He realized the boy wasn't simply lonely. He was drowning. The storm arrived 3 nights later, sweeping across northern Vermont with fierce winds and heavy snow that buried roads, rattled windows, and left Ashford Falls wrapped beneath the kind of brutal January darkness that made the entire world feel isolated from everything beyond its frozen borders, while weather reports crackled constantly across local radios, warning residents to stay indoors unless absolutely necessary. By evening, most of the town had disappeared behind curtains of snow. Streetlights glowed dimly through the blizzard like fading lanterns. The diner downtown closed early. Church services were canceled. Even the train station near the edge of town stood nearly abandoned beneath drifting snow and violent gusts of wind that howled through empty platforms. Inside his home on Willow Street, Thomas Whitaker sat beside the living room fireplace grading essays while Margaret knitted quietly in her chair near the radio. And although the warmth of the room should have felt comforting, the crackling fire, the soft jazz music, the smell of cinnamon tea lingering in the air, Thomas found himself distracted by an uneasiness he could neither explain nor ignore. Twice already that evening, he had glanced toward the telephone. 3 times he had looked out the front window into the storm. Margaret noticed, of course. She always noticed. "You're worried about that boy again," she said gently without looking up from her knitting. Thomas sighed quietly. "I can't shake the feeling something's wrong." Margaret placed the knitting needles down slowly. "You think he's in danger?" Thomas stared into the fire for several seconds before answering. "I think," he said carefully, "that some people become so accustomed to pain that eventually they stop believing they deserve help." The room fell silent except for the wind battering the windows. Margaret studied her husband thoughtfully. "You should call." Thomas shook his head slightly. "And say what? That one of my students looks sad?" "No," Margaret replied softly. "You call because your instincts are usually right." Outside, thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the mountains. Thomas stood and walked toward the window again. Snow swirled violently beneath the streetlights. Then suddenly, his chest tightened. Across the street, moving through the storm beneath weak yellow light, he saw a lone figure walking quickly down Willow Street with shoulders hunched against the wind. Thin, dark jacket, hands shoved deep into pockets. Thomas froze. Daniel. For one confused moment, Thomas simply watched him disappear into the blizzard moving toward the edge of town. Then instinct took over. "I'm going out," he said immediately. Margaret stood quickly. "In this weather?" But Thomas was already reaching for his coat. "I'll be back soon." The wind hit him like ice the moment he stepped outside. Snow lashed violently against his face as he hurried toward his car, and although visibility had become dangerously poor even within town limits, he kept thinking about the expression on Daniel's face, the last time he'd seen him standing in that dark doorway beneath the bruise along his jaw. Fear, hopelessness, the terrible exhaustion of someone running out of strength. Thomas drove slowly through nearly empty streets while windshield wipers fought uselessly against thick snow, and after several tense minutes, he spotted faint footprints leading away from the road toward Miller's Lake near the edge of town. His stomach dropped instantly. The lake. Even in summer, Miller's Lake carried a strange loneliness about it. In winter it became something harsher, a frozen emptiness surrounded by black trees and silence. Thomas left the car running and stepped into the storm. The cold was immediate and brutal, burning his lungs with every breath as snow crunched beneath his boots while he followed the footprints toward the shoreline, barely visible through darkness. "Daniel!" he shouted into the wind. No answer, only the storm. Then finally, through the swirling snow near the frozen dock, Thomas saw him. Daniel stood motionless facing the lake. His shoulders trembled slightly beneath the storm. For one terrible moment, Thomas understood exactly how fragile this night truly was. He approached slowly, careful not to startle him. "Daniel." The boy didn't turn around. Snow gathered across his dark hair and coat. "I didn't know where else to go," he said finally, his voice almost lost beneath the wind. Thomas stopped a few feet behind him. The frozen lake stretched endlessly into darkness ahead like a world without direction or light. For several long moments neither spoke. Then Daniel laughed softly, not with humor, with defeat. "You ever get tired?" he asked quietly. "Like, really tired?" Thomas felt his throat tighten. "Yes," he answered honestly. Daniel stared across the ice. "I keep thinking maybe things are supposed to get better," he whispered. "But they don't." The storm roared around them. Thomas stepped closer carefully. "Daniel, my dad says I'm weak," he interrupted, "that I'll never become anything." Thomas said nothing. Because right now the boy didn't need lectures. He needed someone to stay. Daniel's voice shook slightly now. And maybe he's right. Thomas looked at the frightened teenager standing alone in the storm, and suddenly remembered something he himself had once needed desperately at 17 years old. Not advice, not solutions, not perfection. Hope. Simple hope. So Thomas spoke quietly, but with complete certainty. "Listen to me carefully, Daniel." The boy finally turned slightly toward him. And there, beneath snow and darkness and heartbreak, Thomas saw tears frozen along his cheeks. "Sometimes," Thomas said, "the most broken kids grow into the strongest adults because they learn how to survive things other people never even have to face." Daniel stared at him silently. "You are not weak," Thomas continued softly. "You're exhausted. There's a difference." The storm seemed quieter suddenly. Or perhaps the world had narrowed to only this moment. Thomas stepped closer, and one day, he said gently, "You're going to leave this town, and you're going to build a life that feels nothing like the one you came from." Daniel's face crumpled slightly then, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the painful expression of someone hearing kindness at the exact moment they had almost stopped believing they deserved it. For several seconds he simply stood there shaking in the cold while tears mixed with snow on his face. Then finally, in a broken whisper, he asked, "You really believe that?" Thomas never hesitated. "Yes," he said. And many years later, long after that frozen night disappeared into memory, Daniel Harper would still remember the way those words sounded against the storm. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Ashford Falls sometime in late March, when the heavy snowbanks along Main Street began collapsing into dirty gray slush beneath weak afternoon sunlight, and thin streams of melted ice trickled along sidewalks that had remained frozen for months, while the townspeople, exhausted by another endless Vermont winter, stepped outside with the cautious optimism of people relearning how warmth felt after surviving too much cold. For Daniel Harper, however, the change arrived far more quietly. There was no dramatic transformation, no miraculous overnight happiness. Pain. Thomas Whitaker understood better than most people. Rarely disappeared all at once. Instead, healing usually arrived in fragile moments so small they were almost invisible at first, like the earliest signs of spring appearing beneath frozen earth before anyone trusted they would survive. And yet, something inside Daniel had shifted after that night by the lake. Not completely, not permanently, but enough. Enough for him to begin showing up again. Enough for him to lift his eyes occasionally during class instead of staring endlessly at his desk. Enough for Thomas to notice that although sadness still lived heavily behind the boy's expression, hopelessness no longer seemed quite so absolute. One rainy afternoon in April, Thomas remained after school organizing papers while soft jazz drifted quietly from the classroom radio, and students hurried through the hallways outside beneath umbrellas and raincoats, complaining loudly about homework, sports practice, and the miserable weather in ways only teenagers could, completely unaware that one day they would miss these ordinary afternoons more than they could possibly imagine. Daniel entered the classroom nearly 20 minutes after the final bell, carrying a large cardboard portfolio beneath his arm. Thomas looked up from his desk. "You're late," he said lightly. Daniel shrugged faintly. "Bus left already." Thomas smiled. Terrible tragedy. For a brief second, the corner of Daniel's mouth lifted. That alone felt like progress. Rain slid slowly down the classroom windows while the room filled with the comforting smell of old books, coffee, and damp wool coats drying near the radiator. And for several quiet moments, Daniel stood awkwardly near the doorway, as though debating whether he should stay or leave. Finally, he stepped forward. "I wanted to show you something." Thomas adjusted his glasses. "Go ahead." Daniel placed the portfolio carefully across the desk and opened it with surprising nervousness, revealing dozens of detailed architectural sketches unlike anything Thomas had seen from him before, because while earlier drawings had carried loneliness in nearly every line and shadow, these new designs contained something softer, possibility. Large sunlit libraries, open windows overlooking lakes, schools filled with natural light, warm family homes with wide front porches and fireplaces, places designed not simply for living, but for feeling safe. Thomas slowly turned each page while genuine admiration spread across his face. "Daniel," he said quietly, "these are extraordinary." Daniel looked down immediately. "They're probably not good enough." Thomas leaned back in his chair and studied him carefully. "Do you know how many talented people destroy themselves because they spend their entire lives believing they aren't enough?" Daniel remained silent. Thomas closed the portfolio gently. "You have a gift," he continued, "but more importantly, you have vision." The rain outside intensified slightly. tapping rhythmically against the glass while thunder rolled faintly beyond town. Daniel swallowed hard before speaking again. I applied somewhere. Thomas blinked. Applied where? Daniel hesitated as though saying it aloud might somehow ruin it. Boston School of Architecture. For a moment, genuine surprise crossed Thomas's face, followed almost immediately by pride so deep he struggled to hide it. Well, he said softly, that's remarkable. Daniel laughed nervously. I probably won't get in. You don't know that. My grades aren't great. Your life hasn't been easy. Thomas replied gently. Those are different things. Daniel stared quietly at the rain-covered window. You really think someone like me could leave this town? Thomas smiled faintly. Daniel, half the people who ever changed the world started out as lonely kids who thought they'd never escape where they came from. The boy looked down at his hands. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he asked, Did you ever want to leave? Thomas considered the question carefully. When I was young, he said. All the time. What happened? Thomas smiled softly toward the rows of empty desks around the classroom. I stayed because eventually I realized something important. Daniel looked up. You don't always have to leave a place to change someone's life. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel nodded slowly, as though committing those words somewhere deep inside himself. Outside, rain continued falling across Ashford Falls, while somewhere down the hallway, lockers slammed and distant laughter echoed through the old building. But inside, room 214, something quieter and far more important was happening. A frightened 17-year-old boy, who had spent most of his life believing he was unwanted, was beginning, very carefully, to imagine a future for himself. And although Thomas Whitaker could not possibly know it yet, that future would eventually carry Daniel Harper hundreds of miles away from Ashford Falls into a life filled with success, recognition, and beautiful buildings designed to shelter other lonely people from the coldness he himself had once survived. But years later, Daniel would still remember this classroom most clearly. Not because it changed his career, because it changed the way he saw himself. The house on Willow Street always became quieter after sunset. Not ordinary quietness, but the kind that settled deeply into walls and furniture after years of absence, until even the smallest sounds, the ticking clock above the fireplace, the creaking staircase, the distant hum of passing cars beyond rain-covered windows, began to feel unnaturally loud against the emptiness left behind by someone who once filled every room without effort. Thomas Whitaker had lived alone for 12 years now, long enough to develop routines around grief, long enough to understand that loneliness did not always arrive dramatically. More often, it appeared in ordinary moments so small they seemed harmless until suddenly they became unbearable. A second coffee cup he no longer needed. A joke he turned instinctively to share before remembering there was no one beside him. An empty chair. A half-forgotten song. By late evening, cold October rain drifted steadily across Ashford Falls while weak yellow streetlights reflected against wet sidewalks outside Thomas's living room window. And inside the old house the air smelled faintly of dust, books, and cedar wood from the dying fire glowing softly in the fireplace. On the record player beside the bookshelf, Ella Fitzgerald sang quietly through faint vinyl static, her warm voice filling the room with memories Thomas sometimes welcomed and sometimes feared. Tonight, unfortunately, the memories arrived stronger than usual. The letter still rested on the coffee table. "You saved my life, Mr. Whitaker." Thomas had read those words at least 20 times since morning, and each time they stirred something unsettled inside him. Not pride exactly, but confusion mixed with longing, because after years spent believing his life had slowly faded into irrelevance, the possibility that someone still remembered him felt strangely overwhelming. He sat heavily in his armchair and rubbed tired fingers across his eyes before glancing toward the chair beside the fireplace. Margaret's chair. Even after 12 years, he had never moved it. The blue knitted blanket she loved still rested neatly folded across the armrest, carrying the faint lingering scent of lavender if he leaned close enough. Although lately he wondered whether that scent existed anymore, or whether memory had simply become stronger than reality. Thomas closed his eyes. Immediately, the past returned. Margaret standing in the kitchen laughing while flour covered her hands during Thanksgiving preparations. Margaret dancing slowly with him in the living room while Sinatra played softly after midnight. Margaret sitting exactly where the empty chair now stood, reading novels beside the fire while autumn rain tapped gently against the windows. The strange thing about grief, Thomas had learned, was that it did not simply remove people from your life. It removed entire versions of yourself. Before Margaret died, he had been someone different, lighter, more certain. The world itself had felt warmer somehow. After the funeral, neighbors filled the house with casseroles and sympathy cards for several weeks before slowly returning to their own lives, and eventually the silence arrived for good, settling over the room so completely that some evenings Thomas left the television running all night just to avoid hearing the emptiness. Outside, wind rattled branches against the windows. Thomas opened his eyes slowly and looked toward the bookshelf where dozens of framed photographs stood beneath the lamp glow. Vacations, Christmas mornings, school retirement party. Margaret smiling beside the garden roses she loved. An entire life frozen inside wooden frames. He stood carefully and walked toward the kitchen. The floorboards creaked beneath every step now. Age announced itself in sounds. He filled the kettle slowly while staring absently through the dark window above the sink, where rainwater slid down the glass in silver trails beneath the porch light. 12 years. Sometimes it still shocked him. The kettle began softly whistling. Thomas reached automatically for 2 mugs before stopping himself halfway. For several long seconds he simply stood there staring at the second cup in his hand, then quietly returned it to the cabinet. The loneliness of old age, he often thought, came less from being alone and more from realizing how many ordinary moments no longer belong to anyone except you. As tea steeped quietly on the counter, Thomas wandered toward the hallway closet, searching for an old photo album he suddenly felt compelled to revisit, and while moving several dusty boxes aside, he accidentally knocked over a small tin container that fell onto the floor with a dull metallic clang. Letters spilled everywhere. Margaret's letters. Thomas froze. For a moment he simply stared down at the scattered envelopes written in her soft, elegant handwriting. And suddenly the air inside the hallway felt too thin to breathe properly. Slowly he knelt despite the ache in his knees and picked one up carefully. The envelope had been opened decades earlier. Inside was a short note Margaret had written him during their first year of marriage while he attended a teaching conference in Chicago. Thomas unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. "You always think your life is ordinary," she had written. "But one day, someone will tell you that your kindness changed everything for them." His chest tightened painfully. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the distant hills. Thomas lowered the letter slowly while emotion rose unexpectedly inside him. Because after all these years, after all the silence and grief and loneliness, it suddenly felt as though Margaret herself had somehow reached across time to place a gentle hand against his shoulder once again. Then the telephone rang. The sound startled him so sharply the letter nearly slipped from his hands. Thomas looked toward the living room in confusion. Nobody called this late anymore. The phone rang again. Slowly, uneasily, he walked toward it while rain continued falling endlessly outside the old house on Willow Street. The telephone continued ringing through the quiet house with a sharpness that felt strangely unnatural against the soft rhythm of rain tapping along the windows. And for several seconds, Thomas Whitaker simply stood motionless in the hallway, holding Margaret's old letter in one trembling hand while a heavy feeling settled slowly into his chest. Because people rarely called after 9 o'clock anymore unless something had happened. By the third ring, he finally crossed the living room and lifted the receiver. "Hello." For a moment there was only silence, then static, faint breathing. Thomas frowned slightly. "Hello?" The line crackled softly before a woman's voice answered. "Thomas, it's Emily." Relief moved through him quietly. Emily Carter lived 3 houses down and possessed the strange ability to worry about people without ever making it feel intrusive, although lately Thomas suspected she checked on him more often than she admitted. "You all right?" she asked gently. Your porch light was still on. Thomas glanced toward the clock above the fireplace. Nearly 10:30. "I'm fine," he replied softly. "Just couldn't sleep." "Well," Emily said with warm hesitation, "I baked too much peach cobbler again tomorrow, so if you don't help me get rid of it, I'll be forced to eat the entire thing myself and blame you for the consequences." Despite himself, Thomas smiled faintly. "That sounds serious." "It is." For several moments they spoke quietly about ordinary things. The weather, the storm coming later that week, the hardware store downtown finally replacing its broken sign. And although the conversation itself seemed unimportant, Thomas felt unexpectedly grateful for the simple comfort of another human voice filling the house. Before hanging up, Emily paused. "You sound tired tonight." Thomas looked toward Margaret's empty chair. "Just remembering things, I guess." Emily's voice softened. "Sometimes remembering hurts because it mattered." After the call ended, the silence returned immediately, though somehow it felt less heavy now. Thomas slowly placed the receiver down before returning to the scattered letters near the hallway floor. But as he bent carefully to gather them, his eyes drifted once more toward the mysterious envelope resting on the coffee table. "You saved my life, Mr. Whitaker." Even now, the words unsettled him, not because he doubted their sincerity, because he doubted himself. Teachers rarely witnessed the long-term impact of their lives. Students graduated. Years passed. People disappeared into adulthood carrying invisible memories their teachers never saw. Most of the time, Thomas had assumed his role in those lives faded quickly after graduation ceremonies and yearbooks were forgotten. And yet something about Daniel Harper lingered stubbornly in his mind now. The tired eyes, the sketchbook, the snowstorm by the lake. Thomas sat slowly in his armchair and stared into the dying fire while old memories drifted through him with increasing clarity. And for the first time in decades, he found himself wondering what had actually become of that lonely 17-year-old boy after leaving Ashford Falls. Did he escape? Did life become kinder to him? Had he found happiness somewhere? Or had the world eventually broken him the way it broke so many fragile young people who carried too much pain too early? The question stayed with Thomas long after midnight, and sometime near dawn, exhausted by memory and rain and loneliness, he finally fell asleep in the armchair beside the fading fire. The next morning arrived wrapped in thick fog that drifted heavily through Ashford Falls like smoke rising from the earth itself, softening the outlines of houses, church steeples, and empty streets beneath pale October light, while the town moved slowly through another cold autumn day. Thomas awoke stiff and disoriented beneath the blanket Emily had draped over him years earlier after Margaret's funeral, and for several moments he remained motionless, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around him before remembering the letter waiting on the coffee table. The loneliness returned immediately, but so did curiosity. After dressing carefully and brewing fresh coffee, Thomas stepped onto the front porch to retrieve the morning paper, and the cold air carried the smell of wet leaves, chimney smoke, and distant rain lingering somewhere beyond the hills. The mailbox stood slightly open. Thomas frowned. He didn't remember checking it again. Slowly, he crossed the porch. Inside the mailbox rested another envelope, cream-colored. No return address. His pulse quickened instantly. For several seconds he simply stared at it while cold wind rustled through the maple trees lining Willow Street. Then, with trembling fingers, he picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakable now. Older, perhaps. Slightly shakier, but familiar. Thomas carried the envelope inside without even noticing the newspaper slipping beneath his arm onto the porch floor. Back in the kitchen, he sat carefully at the table and opened the letter with growing unease. Inside was a single photograph, old, faded at the corners. Thomas stared at it silently. Ashford Falls High School. Spring of 1972. A group photo from the Literature Club. Young faces frozen in time beneath bright afternoon sunlight. And there, standing near the back row beside the classroom windows, was Daniel Harper. Thin, serious, uncomfortable in front of cameras. Thomas's throat tightened unexpectedly. He had forgotten how young Daniel looked back then. 17, still practically a child. Slowly, Thomas turned the photograph over. Written carefully across the back were 6 simple words. "I never forgot you, Mr. Whitaker." For a long moment, the kitchen disappeared around him. the rain, the dishes, the old clock ticking softly above the stove. Everything faded beneath the sudden emotional weight pressing against his chest, because after years spent quietly believing he had vanished from the memories of nearly everyone he once taught, these letters felt less like correspondence and more like proof that some small part of his life had mattered after all. Then suddenly something else caught his attention. At the bottom of the photograph, written much smaller beneath the message, was another sentence. Train arrives Friday, 6:15 p.m. Thomas stared at the words. Friday. Tomorrow. Outside, wind moved softly through the trees while somewhere downtown, church bells echoed faintly through the fog-covered streets of Ashford Falls. And for the first time in many years, Thomas Whitaker felt nervous in a way that made him feel strangely young again. Friday evening arrived beneath a sky the color of steel, with cold autumn rain drifting steadily across Ashford Falls, while wind carried wet leaves spinning through empty streets, and storefront reflections shimmered softly against rain-soaked pavement, giving the entire town the melancholy beauty of an old photograph slowly fading with time. Thomas Whitaker had changed sweaters 3 times before finally leaving the house. Not because he cared especially about appearances anymore, but because nervousness had unsettled him in ways he had not experienced for years, and standing alone in his bedroom while searching through old cardigans and neatly folded shirts, he became painfully aware of how long it had been since he'd waited for someone important to arrive. The train station stood near the edge of town beside the river, where rusted tracks disappeared into fog-covered hills, and freight trains still passed occasionally during sleepless nights, their distant whistles echoing through Ashford Falls like lonely reminders that somewhere beyond the town, life continued moving forward. By 6 o'clock, rain had intensified. The station platform glistened beneath weak yellow lamps, while cold wind swept through the nearly empty waiting area, carrying the smell of wet concrete, diesel smoke, and fallen leaves. And as Thomas stepped carefully beneath the awning, he suddenly felt overwhelmed by uncertainty. What exactly was he expecting? A brief thank you? An awkward conversation between strangers connected only by memory? Or perhaps disappointment? After all, 50 years changed people, sometimes beyond recognition. Thomas glanced toward the old station clock mounted above the platform. 6:07 p.m., 7 minutes early. He folded his hands nervously inside his coat pockets and looked out toward the tracks vanishing into darkness. A young couple sat quietly near the far bench sharing headphones. An exhausted conductor smoked beside the ticket office. Rainwater dripped steadily from the station roof. Everything felt strangely cinematic, as though the world itself understood that certain moments divided a life into before and after. Thomas lowered himself carefully onto a wooden bench near the platform edge and tried to steady his breathing. Suddenly he remembered another train station sketch. Daniel's drawing from long ago. A man standing alone beneath platform lights. Some people never stay. The memory unsettled him deeply now. At 6:14, distant headlights finally appeared through the fog. The train emerged slowly from darkness with metallic groans and hissing brakes, while warm yellow light glowed behind rain-covered windows, briefly illuminating rows of unfamiliar faces before the cars settled heavily beside the platform. Thomas stood immediately. His heart pounded harder than it should have. Passengers began stepping off one by one. A businessman carrying a leather briefcase, an elderly woman wrapped in a long gray coat, a young mother holding a sleeping child. Then Thomas froze. A tall man stepped slowly onto the platform wearing a dark wool coat dampened by rain, and although age had transformed him completely, silver threaded through his hair now. Deep lines marked the corners of his eyes, and time had added the quiet heaviness of lived experience across his face. Thomas recognized him instantly, not because of appearance alone, because loneliness still lingered in his eyes. Daniel Harper stood motionless beneath the station lights for several seconds, scanning the platform uncertainly as rain drifted around him in silver streaks. Then their eyes met. Neither man moved at first. 50 years suddenly stood between them like something physical. Half a century of separate lives, separate griefs, separate victories. And yet, in that strange, silent moment, Thomas still saw the frightened 17-year-old boy standing beside a frozen lake during a snowstorm long ago. Daniel took the first step forward, then another. Thomas noticed his hands trembling slightly. Whether from cold or emotion, he couldn't tell. Finally, Daniel stopped in front of him, and for several long seconds neither seemed able to speak. Then softly, almost disbelievingly, Daniel said, "You're really here." Thomas smiled faintly despite the tightness in his chest. "So are you." Daniel laughed quietly then, though emotion cracked beneath the sound almost immediately. "My God," he whispered, shaking his head slightly. "I didn't know if you'd remember me." Thomas looked at him carefully. "Daniel," he said gently, "I never forgot you." Something changed in Daniel's expression the moment he heard those words. Not dramatic, not visible enough for strangers to notice. But Thomas saw it. The same fragile relief he had seen decades earlier inside room 214 whenever kindness unexpectedly reached a boy who had spent most of his life preparing for disappointment instead. Rain continued falling around them while passengers hurried past toward parked cars and distant streetlights reflected across wet train tracks, stretching endlessly into darkness. Finally, Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the old, faded photograph. "You kept this?" Thomas asked softly. Daniel nodded. "For 50 years." Thomas stared at him in disbelief. Daniel looked down briefly before speaking again. "There were nights," he admitted quietly, "when this photograph was the only proof I had that someone once believed I could become more than where I came from." Thomas felt emotion rise so suddenly inside him that for a moment he could not speak at all. Because after decades spent believing his career had been ordinary, insignificant even, he was beginning to realize something extraordinary and deeply humbling. While he had simply been living his life, someone else had been surviving because of it. And standing together beneath the dim station lights while cold October rain drifted endlessly through the dark Vermont evening, both men understood that this meeting was no longer simply about memory. It was about redemption. The diner on Maple Street had not changed very much since the early 70s, which somehow felt both comforting and heartbreaking to Thomas Whitaker as he and Daniel stepped inside from the cold October rain. Because the cracked red leather booths, the black and white tiled floor, the fogged windows glowing beneath neon signs, and even the faint smell of coffee mixed with fried onions seemed preserved beneath time like memories the town itself had quietly refused to let disappear. A few customers sat scattered throughout the room beneath dim hanging lights, while an old jukebox near the entrance played Patsy Cline, softly enough to blend with the steady tapping of rain against the windows. And for several moments Thomas found himself overwhelmed by the strange unreality of sitting across from Daniel Harper after half a century apart. Because although years had transformed the frightened teenager into a gray-haired man with tired eyes and careful manners, something deeply familiar still remained beneath the surface. The waitress brought coffee without asking. Small towns remembered people that way. "You still drink it black?" she asked Thomas warmly. He smiled faintly. "Some habits survive old age." After she walked away, silence settled gently between the two men while steam rose from their coffee cups and headlights passed slowly outside through sheets of rain. Daniel wrapped both hands around the mug as though steadying himself. "I thought about this moment for years," he admitted quietly, staring down into the coffee rather than at Thomas directly. "And somehow, I still don't know where to begin." Thomas studied him carefully across the booth. "You already did," he said softly. "You came back." Daniel let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like pain. "You have no idea how many times I almost didn't." The words lingered heavily between them. Outside, thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the hills while wind rattled dead leaves along the sidewalk. Thomas waited patiently. Years of teaching had taught him something many people never understood, that the most important conversations often began only after silence had been allowed enough room to breathe. Finally, Daniel looked up. "You remember that night at the lake?" he asked. Thomas nodded slowly. "I never forgot it." Daniel gave a faint smile filled more with sadness than warmth. "I think about it constantly." For several seconds he seemed to search for the right words, though Thomas sensed the difficulty came less from memory itself than from finally allowing himself to speak aloud truths he had carried alone for most of his life. "My mother died 3 months after graduation," Daniel said quietly. "Cancer." Thomas lowered his eyes briefly. "I'm sorry." Daniel nodded once. "My father drank himself into the ground after that." He paused. "Honestly, I think he died long before his heart finally gave out." The diner lights reflected softly across rain-covered windows, while the jukebox continued playing old songs no one really listened to anymore. Thomas remained silent. Daniel swallowed hard before continuing. "The strange thing is..." He hesitated again. "I spent years telling myself I hated him." Thomas looked at him carefully. "But..." Daniel stared toward the dark street outside. "But eventually I realized broken people usually break other people because they don't know how to survive themselves." The sentence hit Thomas with unexpected force, not because it sounded rehearsed, because it sounded painfully earned. Daniel leaned back slightly in the booth while exhaustion drifted across his face, and suddenly Thomas understood that success had not erased this man's wounds nearly as completely as the world probably assumed. "You know what scared me most back then?" Daniel asked quietly. Thomas shook his head. It wasn't being poor. Daniel smiled bitterly. It wasn't even the yelling. His voice lowered almost to a whisper. It was believing my life would never become anything different. The rain outside intensified. Daniel continued staring through the window while memories seemed to move silently behind his eyes. I remember sitting in your classroom after school because it was the only place that ever felt calm, he admitted. I'd pretend to organize my books just so I didn't have to go home yet. Thomas felt his chest tighten. And you never pushed me, Daniel continued softly. You never embarrassed me. You never looked at me like I was some broken thing people needed to fix. He paused. You listened. The word landed harder than gratitude itself, because Thomas suddenly realized that all the moments he himself had considered ordinary kindness had been experienced by Daniel as something life-changing simply because so few people had ever offered it to him before. Daniel reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping worn thin at the edges from age. Thomas frowned slightly as Daniel handed it across the table. It was an article from 1989. Chicago architect wins National Design Award. Beneath the headline stood a photograph of a much younger Daniel beside a modern lakeside library filled with sunlight and towering glass windows. Thomas looked up in surprise. You designed this? Daniel nodded. After it was finished, a reporter asked me why all my buildings have so much natural light. A faint, emotional smile crossed his face. I told him because dark rooms make lonely people feel invisible. Thomas stared at him silently. Daniel lowered his eyes. I think I've spent my entire life trying to build the kind of places I needed when I was young. The waitress returned briefly to refill coffee before disappearing again beneath the soft glow of diner lights and the distant sound of dishes clattering somewhere behind the kitchen doors. Then finally, after years of carrying it inside himself, Daniel spoke the truth he had traveled all this way to say. That night at the lake. His voice trembled slightly now. I really didn't think I was going to survive much longer. Thomas felt his hands tighten around the coffee mug. Daniel looked directly at him for the first time since sitting down. And then you told me I wasn't weak. Silence filled the booth. Not empty silence. The kind filled with memory and grief and gratitude, too large for ordinary conversation. Daniel's eyes glistened slightly beneath the diner lights. You have to understand something, Mr. Whitaker, he said quietly. When a child spends years hearing they're worthless, eventually they start believing it. Thomas could barely speak. But you, Daniel whispered, were the first person who ever looked at me and saw something worth saving. The words struck Thomas so deeply that suddenly he could no longer hide the emotion rising inside him, because after decades spent believing his life had been small and forgettable, this man sitting across from him was revealing that kindness Thomas himself barely remembered offering had echoed across another human being's entire existence. Daniel smiled weakly through wet eyes. I know teachers probably hear thank you speeches all the time. Thomas shook his head immediately. No, he said softly. We really don't. Daniel laughed quietly through the emotion. Well, he swallowed hard. Then let me say what I should have said 50 years ago. He leaned forward slightly. Thank you for saving my life. And for the first time since Margaret's death, Thomas Whitaker felt something inside his chest begin to heal. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale autumn sunlight and drifting fog that moved slowly through the streets of Ashford Falls like lingering memory, softening rooftops and church steeples beneath a sky washed clean by the previous night's rain, while the town itself seemed quieter than usual, as though even the wind understood that certain days carried the fragile weight of returning to places people once believed they had left forever. Thomas had barely slept. Long after returning home from the diner, he had remained awake beside the living room fire, replaying every word Daniel spoke, because the conversation had unsettled him in ways he could not fully explain. Not painfully, but profoundly, forcing him to confront the possibility that an ordinary life devoted quietly to kindness might have mattered far more than he had ever allowed himself to believe. At 9 o'clock sharp, Daniel arrived at the house carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner downtown. "Figured you'd already had one," he said with a faint smile as Thomas opened the door. "But old habits deserve reinforcement." Thomas laughed softly. "You remember that?" "I remember everything about those classrooms," Daniel replied. The sentence lingered gently between them. Outside, leaves drifted slowly across Willow Street, while distant church bells echoed through the crisp October air. After a short drive through town, they arrived at Ashford Falls High School. The building looked smaller now, older. Time had faded the once bright brick exterior, while ivy climbed portions of the eastern walls, and several classroom windows showed signs of repairs completed decades apart. Yet standing there beneath the cool autumn sunlight, Thomas felt memories returning with almost painful clarity. Friday night football games, fire drills, student laughter spilling through hallways, hundreds of young voices layered across 40 years of teaching. Daniel stared at the building silently from the parking lot. "It smells the same," he murmured unexpectedly. Thomas smiled faintly. "What does?" "Wet leaves and old paper." For a moment they simply stood there together. 2 old men carrying different versions of the same past. Inside, the school secretary nearly dropped her glasses when she recognized Thomas. "Mr. Whitaker?" she gasped warmly. "Lord, it's good to see you." Within minutes, they were walking slowly through familiar hallways, while students moved around them in noisy clusters carrying backpacks and phones, laughing too loudly, complaining about homework, completely unaware that one day these ordinary moments would become the memories they missed most painfully. The building itself had changed surprisingly little. The floors still creaked near the east stairwell. The radiators still hissed unevenly. The faint smell of chalk dust and old books still lingered in the air despite decades of renovations. As they passed the trophy cases near the gymnasium, Daniel slowed slightly. "You know," he said quietly, "when you're a lonely kid, schools become strange places." Thomas looked toward him. "How so?" Daniel watched students passing through the hallway. "For some people, school is just where they take classes," he said. "For others, it's the safest place they know." The words settled deeply inside Thomas, because suddenly he realized something heartbreaking. While many teachers measured success through grades and graduation rates, some students measured it far more simply, by whether a classroom felt safe enough to breathe inside. Eventually, they reached room 214. Thomas stopped walking. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The old classroom door remained exactly the same. Same narrow window, same faded brass number plate. Even the scratch near the handle still remained. Daniel smiled faintly. My God. Thomas opened the door slowly. The room was empty. Morning sunlight streamed softly through tall windows overlooking the football field, while rows of desks sat perfectly still beneath floating dust particles that drifted lazily through the warm golden light. And instantly the years seemed to collapse around them as memories flooded every corner of the room. Thomas walked toward the windows almost automatically. I used to stand right there every morning, he said quietly. Daniel nodded. And I sat back there pretending not to listen. Thomas laughed softly beneath his breath. You were listening. All the time. The classroom smelled exactly as Daniel remembered. Books, wood polish, coffee, old paper. And standing inside it again filled him with such unexpected emotion that for several moments he struggled to steady himself against the overwhelming realization that this room had quietly become the place where his life first began changing direction. He moved slowly toward the back row near the window. His desk, still there, smaller than memory had preserved it. Daniel ran his fingers gently along the surface, and suddenly he saw everything again. Snow outside the windows. The sound of Thomas explaining literature while sunlight crossed the blackboard. The afternoons he stayed after class simply because he couldn't bear going home yet. The terrifying loneliness he had carried silently at 17. And the quiet teacher who somehow noticed anyway. Thomas watched him carefully. You all right? Daniel nodded slowly, though emotion thickened his voice. I think, he admitted softly. This room saved me long before I realized it. The words settled into the quiet classroom while distant student laughter echoed faintly through the hallway outside. Then Daniel reached into his coat pocket and removed something carefully wrapped in folded paper. I brought this for you. Thomas frowned slightly as Daniel handed it over. Inside rested a fountain pen. Old, black lacquer worn smooth with age. Thomas stared at it in confusion. Daniel smiled faintly. You left it on my desk the day I graduated. Thomas looked up, stunned. I told you to keep writing, Daniel continued quietly. I've carried it with me ever since. For several long seconds, Thomas could not speak at all. Because suddenly, standing inside the same classroom where he had once believed he was simply teaching literature to distracted teenagers, he finally understood something Margaret had tried telling him for years. People rarely remember every lesson, but they never forget how someone made them feel when they needed kindness most. By late afternoon, the sky above Ashford Falls had turned the soft silver-gray color that often arrived before rain in northern Vermont. And as Thomas Whitaker guided his old car along the narrow, winding road leading toward Miller's Lake, fallen leaves drifted endlessly across the pavement, while cold wind moved through the trees with the low whispering sound of distant voices carried through memory. Neither man had spoken very much after leaving the school. Some places, Thomas understood, left people emotionally exhausted not because they were painful, but because they reminded them too clearly of who they once had been before life hardened around them. Daniel sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the woods pass beyond the rain-speckled window. His expression distant in the way people looked when traveling not only through physical places, but through years they had spent trying unsuccessfully to forget. When the lake finally appeared through the trees, Thomas felt his chest tighten unexpectedly. Time had changed surprisingly little here. The old wooden dock still stretched crookedly over the dark water. Tall pine trees still surrounded the shoreline. Even the faded boathouse near the eastern edge of the lake remained standing beneath layers of peeling paint and weather damage, stubbornly surviving decades of harsh winters, much the same way people sometimes survived grief. Thomas parked near the shoreline. For several moments, neither man moved. The lake rested beneath complete stillness, except for gentle ripples spreading across the dark water beneath gathering clouds, and somewhere far across the opposite shore, a lone bird called softly into the quiet. Finally, Daniel opened the car door. Cold wind swept immediately across the shoreline as they walked slowly toward the dock, their footsteps crunching through wet leaves scattered beneath the trees. And with every step, Thomas felt memories returning with uncomfortable clarity until suddenly it no longer seemed possible that 50 years had passed since the night he found a frightened teenager standing alone here during a snowstorm. Daniel stopped near the edge of the dock. "This place used to terrify me," he admitted quietly. Thomas looked toward him. "Because of that night?" Daniel nodded slowly. "For years afterward, I couldn't even look at frozen water without remembering how empty everything felt." The wind stirred gently across the lake while gray clouds thickened overhead. Thomas remained silent. Some truths needed room before they could fully emerge. Daniel stared across the dark water for a long time before speaking again. "You know something strange?" he said softly. "When people talk about depression, they usually describe sadness." He gave a faint, humorless smile. "But that's not what I remember most." Thomas watched him carefully. "What do you remember?" Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the lake. "Exhaustion," he whispered. "The kind that settles so deeply inside you that even imagining another year feels impossible." The words hung heavily between them. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, simply honest. And somehow, honesty carried far more weight. Daniel shoved his hands deeper into his coat pockets against the cold wind. "I used to think something was wrong with me because everybody else seemed capable of living normally while I felt like I was drowning all the time," he admitted. "At school, I'd watch kids laugh in the hallways or complain about football games or homework, and I remember thinking, how does life feel so easy for them?" Thomas lowered his eyes briefly. Because although he had suspected pieces of this truth years ago, hearing it spoken aloud now filled him with a sadness no teacher ever truly learned how to protect themselves against. The knowledge that children often suffered enormous invisible battles while adults around them remained unaware. Daniel continued quietly. "The night you found me here, I honestly believed nobody would notice if I disappeared." Thomas felt emotion tighten painfully in his chest. "But then you came looking for me." Rain began falling lightly across the lake. Small silver circles spread across the dark surface of the water. Daniel smiled faintly through the sadness. "You know what's strange?" he asked softly. "I barely remember most of the exact conversation anymore." Thomas looked surprised. "I don't. No. Daniel shook his head slowly. But I remember how your voice sounded. The rain intensified slightly. You sounded like someone who genuinely believed I had a future, Daniel whispered. And when a person spends years feeling invisible, that kind of belief becomes life-saving. For several long moments, the two men stood silently beside the lake while cold rain drifted through the trees around them. And Thomas suddenly realized that all these years he had misunderstood the true nature of teaching. It had never really been about literature, or grades, or lectures. It had been about witnessing people, especially the ones quietly disappearing in plain sight. Daniel finally turned toward him. I spent most of my life trying to repay what you gave me, he admitted. Thomas frowned softly. You don't owe me anything. Daniel smiled sadly. That's the thing about kindness, he said. The people who save others almost never understand the size of what they've done. The rain continued falling gently around them while evening slowly settled across Miller's Lake. And for the first time in many years, Thomas Whitaker no longer felt haunted by the fear that his life had been too small to matter. Because standing beside that dark water, listening to the man Daniel Harper had become, he finally understood that even quiet lives could echo across generations in ways impossible to measure. The rain stopped sometime during the night, leaving Ashford Falls wrapped in the kind of peaceful autumn morning that seemed almost too beautiful to belong entirely to the real world. As golden sunlight filtered softly through thinning trees while wet sidewalks shimmered beneath drifting leaves, and the cold air carried the comforting smell of wood smoke, coffee, and earth still damp from yesterday's storm. Thomas Whitaker woke earlier than usual. For several moments he remained lying quietly beneath heavy blankets, listening to the familiar sounds of the old house around him. The creaking pipes, the ticking hallway clock, the distant rumble of a delivery truck somewhere downtown. And gradually he became aware of something unfamiliar resting gently inside his chest. Peace. Not complete peace. Grief still existed. Loneliness still visited. Margaret was still gone. But for the first time in years, those things no longer felt like proof that his life had ended emotionally the moment hers had. Instead, they felt like evidence that he had once loved deeply enough for absence to hurt. And strangely, that realization comforted him. Downstairs, sunlight spilled warmly across the kitchen table where Daniel's photograph still rested beside the second letter. And as Thomas brewed coffee while autumn wind moved softly through the trees outside the window, memories from the previous day replayed continuously through his mind. The train station, the old classroom, the lake. Daniel's trembling voice saying thank you through 50 years of unspoken gratitude. Thomas had spent so much of retirement quietly mourning the belief that his life no longer mattered that he had almost failed to notice the truth standing directly in front of him all along. Meaning rarely disappeared simply because people stopped talking about it. Some acts of kindness continued living silently inside others for decades. A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas opened it to find Emily Carter standing on the porch, wrapped in a long brown coat, while holding a paper bag that smelled unmistakably of cinnamon rolls. "Well," she announced lightly, "I figured if you're going to spend all morning staring thoughtfully out windows like a retired poet, you should at least do it with decent pastries." Thomas laughed softly. You spying on me now? I'm old, Emily replied. Observation becomes a hobby. Inside the kitchen, sunlight filled the room while Emily unpacked breakfast onto the table and immediately noticed the faded photograph beside the coffee mugs. Who's that? She asked gently. Thomas looked down at the image for several seconds before answering. An old student. Emily studied his expression carefully. Not just any student. Thomas smiled faintly. No, he admitted quietly. Not just any student. As he told her about Daniel's visit, Emily listened silently without interruption, and although she occasionally nodded or smiled softly at certain moments, she mostly allowed the story to breathe naturally between them the way compassionate people often do when they understand someone is finally speaking aloud, emotions carried privately for far too long. When he finished, Emily remained quiet for a moment. Then she said something Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. You know, she murmured softly, most people spend their entire lives wondering whether they mattered. Thomas looked toward her, but very few people ever receive proof. The words settled deeply inside him, because she was right. Most lives passed quietly. People raised families, worked jobs, survived losses, offered kindnesses nobody recorded or celebrated, and eventually disappeared believing they had been ordinary. But perhaps ordinary lives were never truly ordinary at all. Perhaps the world itself survived because countless unnoticed people kept choosing compassion in moments nobody else considered important. That afternoon, Thomas found himself wandering upstairs toward the small spare bedroom he had not seriously entered in years. Margaret used to call it the forgotten room. Boxes filled with old teaching supplies still lined the shelves beside dusty novels and fading stacks of student essays tied neatly with string. And as sunlight drifted through the curtains, illuminating particles of dust floating through the air like tiny suspended memories, Thomas suddenly understood what he wanted to do. Not because he needed purpose exactly, because purpose had quietly returned already. What he needed now was connection. By evening, he had placed a handwritten sign inside the front window of the Ashford Falls Public Library. Free Saturday reading class for children. All ages welcome underneath, in smaller letters. Stories help people survive themselves. The librarian smiled warmly after reading it. Looks like retirement didn't last very long, she teased. Thomas smiled. No, he said softly. I suppose it didn't. And as he walked slowly home beneath falling autumn leaves, while church bells echoed gently through the town he had once considered too small to matter, Thomas Whitaker realized something extraordinary. A person could spend years believing their story was ending, only to discover it was quietly beginning again. The first Saturday morning reading class began beneath cold November rain that tapped steadily against the tall library windows, while children's voices echoed softly between shelves filled with old novels, worn encyclopedias, and stories that had survived generations simply because someone once believed words could help lonely people feel less alone. Thomas Whitaker arrived nearly an hour early, not because preparation required it, but because nervousness had followed him throughout the night with surprising intensity, and standing alone inside the quiet library while arranging small wooden chairs into a half circle near the fireplace, He became painfully aware that this was the first time in years he had truly looked forward to waking up. Outside, Ashford Falls moved slowly through another rainy autumn morning beneath gray skies and drifting fog, while inside the library the air smelled wonderfully familiar. Dusty pages, coffee from the librarian's desk, polished wood floors, and the faint comforting scent of old paper aging gently through time. By 10 o'clock, children began arriving one by one, accompanied by parents and grandparents shedding wet coats near the entrance. A shy little girl carrying a stuffed rabbit. Twin boys arguing loudly about comic books. A freckled child with oversized glasses who immediately wandered toward the history section before class even started. Thomas greeted each of them warmly, and with every nervous smile and curious question, he felt something inside himself slowly awakening again. Not youth exactly, but usefulness. A feeling he had missed more than he realized. Soon nearly 12 children sat gathered around him while rain streamed gently down the library windows and firelight flickered softly across rows of bookshelves behind them, creating the kind of peaceful atmosphere Thomas had always believed stories deserved. He opened the novel resting in his lap. "All right," he said with a faint smile. "Today we begin with a very important question." The children looked at him expectantly. Why do people need stories? Several hands shot upward immediately. Because they're fun. Because they're magic. Because they help when you're sad. Thomas smiled softly. "Yes," he said, "all of those things." Then he paused briefly before adding, "And sometimes stories remind people they aren't alone." The words lingered gently in the warm library air, while rain continued tapping against the windows like distant memory. For the next hour, Thomas read aloud with the same quiet passion he had once carried into room 214 decades earlier. And as the children laughed at funny scenes, leaned forward during suspenseful moments, and listened carefully to every word, he realized something beautiful and unexpected. The years had not taken away the part of him that mattered most. Teaching had never truly left him. After class ended, parents slowly gathered coats while children wandered reluctantly toward the exit, still talking excitedly about next Saturday's story, and one by one, the library emptied until only a single boy remained standing quietly near the fireplace. He looked about 10 years old, thin, dark hair falling slightly across tired eyes. Thomas felt something stir gently in his chest. The boy clutched a library book nervously while avoiding eye contact in a painfully familiar way. Finally, Thomas smiled kindly. "You waiting for someone?" The boy shrugged. "My mom works Saturdays." Thomas nodded. "I used to wait in libraries too when I was young." The boy looked up slightly. "You did?" "All the time." Silence settled comfortably between them. Then the boy asked quietly, "Do you think books can really change people?" Thomas looked at him carefully, not just at the child standing there, at the loneliness hidden behind the question. And suddenly, like an echo carried across generations, he remembered another frightened boy sitting in the last row beside a classroom window more than 50 years earlier. Thomas smiled gently. "Yes," he said softly, "I think kindness can too." Outside, rain continued falling across Ashford Falls, while wind carried red and gold leaves through empty streets beneath the fading afternoon light. And inside the warm little library, surrounded by stories and silence, and another child, quietly needing someone to notice him, Thomas Whitaker finally understood something Margaret had known all along. A life devoted to kindness never really disappears. It simply continues living inside the people who needed it most. And as the fire crackled softly beside rows of old books, while the small boy sat down beside him with quiet trust, Thomas no longer felt forgotten. For the first time in many years, he felt home.